Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhaj.
It's Roxanne Derhaj for Authentic Living with Roxanne. Thanks for tuning in again. Today I have a special guest. Omer and I met, it's going to probably be about 6 months ago, where we were privileged to speak on the same stage at a Disrupt Niagara event. So Omer, thanks so much for coming in today to chat with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So I'll tell you a little bit about him, and we're going to jump right in. And he's a peak performance coach. And so we're going to talk a lot about his expertise. He has a background in engineering, which is quite fascinating, along with education in human resources from both U of T and University of Michigan, with 30 years experience in is it the biotech sector, Omer?
More like telecommunications and high tech.
Telecommunication.
Yeah.
So, so thanks for coming in. And we're going to jump right into that whole concept of what is flow. You hear that? I often, my son's a golfer, and you know, he plays as a pretty competitive level, and you'll hear that being talked a lot with athletes, but I'm interested in kind of your perspective about in reference to individual flow and how the kind of work that you do with individuals and organizations to get to flow. But maybe starting with a definition would probably help us.
Sure. So at the very highest level, flow is that state you're in when you feel your best and when you perform your best.
Okay.
So it's a state of optimal experience with spikes of peak performance.
Okay. So is this biological? Is it kind of, I often think I have one child, but, growing up in a family of 6, I swear to God that I think, each one of us had individual personalities. So does flow have anything to do with personality? Or it's a different kind of concept?
Well, flow is a very subjective experience.
Okay.
And what puts you into flow will be based on many kind of individual factors that are unique to you, including your personality. And what'll put me into flow is a completely different set of factors. So the description of flow and the experience of flow can be described with, universally. There's very common characteristics, but it's a very subjective in the moment experience. So even you with your other family members, you would all have very different experiences of flow.
Okay. So when we're thinking of flow, then let's say someone's coming, whether it's an organization or a CEO or a manager that's coming to you, what are some of the elements that you walk through with them to understand flow? And I know you've created some actual products or things that you actually use with people.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that, because I've never gone through anything. I've done, the occupational fits kind of psychological assessments in the past where, one of the things that they thought I should be was a chemist. And I thought, well, I don't think my personality is like that, but it was one of those things that came up, but also executive management was one of the other ones.
Yeah. So
what are some of the things or products that you've developed to help people assess their flow?
Well, so I guess it goes back to work that was done by the Gallup organization. It was a project in the mid-90s called the Good Life Project, where Gallup looked at something like 80,000 managers around the world to try to understand what differentiates a strong manager from an average manager. And so Gallup developed a survey called StrengthsFinder, which basically gives you your top 5 talents from a list of 34. And Gallup has a very clear definition of talents. And so I typically work with companies who are using that survey tool, StrengthsFinder, and now they've kind of tried all the ideas they can think of, and they need a little bit more help from an expert to go a little deeper. So I start with StrengthsFinder.
Okay.
And then basically the fundamental point that I make is the business case is pretty clear now. It's been replicated over and over again in different studies. Your performance, the payoff of your performance is significantly higher if you're practicing your strengths while in the state of flow, significantly higher. So I kind of start there.
And productivity, I would obviously that trend, I'm sure the research that you're just referring to is it a quantifiable kind of percentage that they find that when people are in flow versus when they're out of flow in reference to the bottom line, in reference to like, numbers.
So, and again, I think the reason I'm so interested in this field now is I've been pursuing this line of inquiry for about 25 years, but more and more numbers are starting to come out now. And McKinsey, and anyone's welcome to email me if they want any of this reference material. McKinsey wrote an article where they were actually working with this idea of flow with business executives, and they asked 5,000 executives over the course of a decade, in your view, when you and your team are in flow, how much more productive are you? Mm-hmm. And the most frequent answer is 500%. So when you're in a team, and this kind of step function in performance has been replicated over and over again. We're not talking about doing 10% better or 20% better. We're talking about doing up to 500% better. Now, again, keeping in mind that's not a permanent increase because flow happens in short periods of time. Mm-hmm. But when your team at a company is bursting with flow, that's the type of improvement. 250, 300, 400, 500%. And you can think of, books have been written about high performing teams who have produced something really incredible. And if you look at the tangible results of that product, they're substantially higher.
Well, when I think of data, in my kind of health and wellness consulting for years, what was one thing that we found with mental well-being is that oftentimes people are at work and there's a lot more presenteeism where people are physically there.
Yeah.
And they talk a lot about almost, productivity wanes by 65% or something like that, where people show up and you think they're there. So they're not going to show on your stats or anything, right? They're not going to show on the data for short-term disability or potentially even EAP claims or things like that. Because those people, they sit somewhere and they're showing up, they're attending meetings or those types of things, but their productivity is actually altered. So I would think that flow would be a really kind of a great solution for that, because if people are in flow, one would assume that, they'd be able to kind of recognize when they're dipping out of being present and then in turn less productive.
Absolutely. And I think probably the metric that keeps both of us up at night is the Gallup survey that's done year over year measuring people's engagement. Mm-hmm. And that number hasn't changed much over the last 20 years. And the number of people who are actively engaged at companies is in the order of 15 to 20%, to your point. Mm-hmm. And I think if any of us think back to when we were doing something, even if it's outside of work, but if you can think about a time where you were so absorbed, you lost complete track of time, your sense of worry fell away, yourself how you were performing as compared to when you're kind of struggling with that presenteeism. It's a fundamental difference.
Right, because I often say I'm kind of for time, let's just use one variable, which is time.
Yeah.
I'm not a super, super early person and I'm not a super, super late person. So I often say I'm kind of optimally, the time period for me is kind of like 11 to 1. That seems to be when I'm ultimately seem to get a lot done.
Yeah.
And past that, I'm kind of, I'm doing things, but I know I'm not at, like you said, at optimal productivity. And prior to that, I'd get stuff done, but again, not as much. But in that gap seems to be just from kind of noticing what's good for me.
Well, and then you'll notice sometimes, so that's kind of your creative window. And sometimes it'll be 11 o'clock and you'll start doing something. And the next time you look at the clock, it's 1 o'clock and you didn't even notice the 2 hours disappear. Right. That's probably that's the most universally quoted characteristic, is I lost complete track of time.
And we all, I mean, you know, when I think about that, or even when I'm writing or creating, that's the time that I want to be in. But, you know, it's fleeting, Omer. Sometimes I'm like, oh, yesterday I felt so good and everything came out. And then today I'm like, oh, I just have to redo that 10 times and it's still not good. So let's talk about some of the things that people can actually do, right? You talk a little bit about the strength finders. So I guess that would be something that people, if they really, really wanted to dig down deeper, they would have to do something like that. But what are some things that the average person could do to get more in flow?
I think in my view, Roxanne, the fundamental building block of flow is this idea of an emotional high. And an emotional high is any activity that you do, whether it takes a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, but anything you do that kind of gives you that jolt of feeling good, that intrinsic satisfaction, that emotional high. That's the fundamental building block. And the more data you can collect, the more you can track your emotional highs. I mean, the one piece of advice I give everyone is track your emotional highs over a period of 4 or 5 weeks. And when you're actually looking at that data, you'll start to see patterns. I mean, you're already starting to, you know, see that you have a creativity window between 11 and 1. When I looked at my emotional data, I find having ideation conversations, discussing a stimulating topic with someone who's also interested in that topic is an emotional high for me. And so the more emotional highs you collect, the more you'll see patterns that you can both replicate and that you can scale. And so that's the one healthiest activity you can do is that. I did have an opportunity to interview ex-NHL hockey player Patrick Sharp. And basically he said the one thing he does when he watches game film is he focuses on when he scored, because it makes him feel as good as he felt when he scored. And he works at sharpening his strengths when he's feeling good from having scored. So go ahead.
Interesting. So is it almost like it's an activity? So in your case, it's ideas. So somebody that stimulates you in a way that gets your cognitive functioning, I'm going to say, fired up. And then you find that gets you into flow. In the hockey player's example, his was looking at the reel. And is he visualizing and implanting that in himself?
Yeah, it was basically so when he scored, it was an emotional high when he scored. And what he found is even when he watches video of having scored, that gives him an emotional high. The beauty of emotional highs is they're very contagious. Even if you review your own list, it starts to make you feel as good as you felt when it happened. And so he's putting himself into this state of feeling good, and then he works on his strengths. See, one of the biggest flow blockers is your inner critic, your inner chatter kind of telling you what you're doing wrong, basically criticizing you. That's a flow blocker. And so if you can work on your strengths while you're feeling good, that inner critic kind of drops away. Does that clarify?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. So, and I mean, you know, if anybody tells you they don't have an inner critic, I think they're telling you a little bit of a little white lie. It depends on how loud it gets, or sometimes it wanes. Sometimes you're like, oh, I can conquer anything. And other times it's like a bullhorn that's kind of going at you.
That's almost yelling at you. And I think when you'll notice when you're in flow, that inner critic actually drops away. That inner critic disappears.
So with the inner critic, let's talk a little bit about that, because the kind of the word that gets thrown around is that 60,000 word thoughts in a day, and what percentage of that is positive versus negative, and what kind of things we kind of try to prime ourselves. So what I try to do is I try to do a gratitude list of things I'm grateful for the first thing in the morning. Not every morning, but sometimes I do a bit of meditation, like a
Mm-hmm.
10 minutes to kind of get myself going in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some other things that in flow that people could actually do to deal with that inner critic? Are there actual techniques that you find help lower that voice versus kind of heightening it?
For sure. I think basically the work that I do is I help people find their own, let's call them flow entry points. So we all have entry points that put us into flow. And I can give you some general entry points, things like if you've read the book Drive by Daniel Pink, he talks about intrinsic motivators like mastery, autonomy, purpose. So clarifying those three things for yourself are flow entry points. Curiosity, passion are flow entry points. If you collect your emotional highs and look at the underlying patterns, like for example, a flow entry point for me, and I suspect probably for you, is learning. I love learning.
Yes.
If I watch, I only need 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes to listen to a podcast or read a chapter of a book or read an article, and that stimulates my thinking. You see how I go back to stimulated thinking is something that puts me into flow. So to your point about gratitude, studies have shown that inner critic speaks at a 9-to-1 ratio between negativity and positivity, and practicing just physically writing out what you're grateful for 5 to 10 minutes a day can actually shift that ratio to 6-to-1.
It actually, just by writing it down.
Just by writing down and actually thinking about what you're grateful for teaches your kind of scanning the environment skill to focus more on challenges you find appealing versus threats, which is what the inner critic is yelling about.
Right. And, another thing that I kind of fell upon, and I don't know if this makes sense, because with me, when I was, kind of shifting from corporate going into my own business, and there's, too many things to be done and not enough hours in a day. And I remember thinking, where I thought I should be again, that thought, that negative kind of, and I remember I had to prepare something for a speaking event or something like that. And they had wanted to know some of the things that I'd done in the business.
Yeah.
And I hadn't really sat down and done that, over a year period. And I sat down, and it took me quite a while. And I was like, oh my goodness. The things that I'd itemized, I hadn't stopped to almost kind of, relish in it, because I was off to something else. And, and obviously in that, there was a lot of pivoting and failures and things I had to adapt and all those things, but there was a lot of accomplishments. And that's one thing that I try to do at the end of every year now, is not just in my business, but also in my personal life, is I try to see what kind of things I've done.
Having that list of accomplishments is critical. And you'll hear people saying, if you haven't updated your resume in 90 days, what have you done? What have you been doing in the last 90 days? So I would recommend even on a quarterly basis as opposed to yearly, but fundamentally, and this is the more important point in my view, is collecting your emotional highs on a daily basis is what'll give you that raw material. Then defining those accomplishments at the end of the year, you just need to draw from this long list you've created, because you've noticed the emotional highs as they happen. And what you'll find is that alone has a bit of a snowball effect. The more you notice, the more you start to notice. And when you start to notice patterns, you actually become more effective when that pattern shows up again. It's a very nice snowball effect.
So I think of it as almost like a performance journal. Then that's the word that's coming to me. I journal a lot, but you're saying to be a little bit more specific then in to think about the periods of the day, not just time, activities. Do you look at it as from a sensory level too? Because a lot of the work that I do a lot of times with awareness, I have leaders and teams look at kind of their leadership story. What are their values? When I looked at my leadership story, kind of why do I do what I do, talking about authenticity, which kind of speaks to my background, my culture. I'm a Trinidadian, kind of growing up in the Caribbean, kind of being exposed to business in a certain way and all those things. So it becomes a combination effect. So for someone that's wanting to start to script this, are there things, I often say to people, look around, what are things that, stimulate you and keep you grounded? Are there sounds or, music sometimes, right? Like, when we
Yeah.
work out,
Well, and that's why I try to use, that's why I'm using the term emotional high,
okay.
is I'm trying to be very, very general, right? Basically anything, and it can literally be anything that you get to define. The only requirement is that it made you feel good, that it
Okay.
gave you a bit of an emotional high.
Okay. Okay.
And it's as simple as that. It needs to be an activity though. But I mean, thinking is an activity.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that you did that made you feel good is the raw material. If I have enough of that data to look at, I will help you find the underlying pattern so you can trigger flow. And when you trigger flow, you boost your performance. So it's just very simply, so even the things that you described about clarifying your leadership style, your vision statement, those are all outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not asking you to clarify those day by day. I'm just asking you to clarify the activities that give you an emotional high. What'll come out of that is your purpose, your vision, your style, what you're suited for. All of that'll come out of that data.
So I'm looking at the last quarter mile and you're saying, okay, back up.
Back
Look
up, yeah.
at what preps you to get out of the
Exactly.
gate. And because you do it, that raw material would help you, if you could understand that thematically, then
Yeah,
what you're going to do is, I'm going to assume you're going to start to implement those more often through your time to be
that's
able to
right.
have more of those states.
That's right. So, and that was a very good way to put it, is flow is not necessarily about focusing on the finish line,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's exactly what you said. It's that preparation, it's the noticing. And as I mentioned, I haven't worked with a person yet who hasn't been surprised by some of their own emotional highs. They couldn't have predicted them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's when you experience an emotional high, you are experiencing a small version of what could be flow.
Can you give me an example of something like that somebody shared with you that was an emotional high that they didn't think that it was significant?
So someone was swimming laps. They typically do 60 laps a morning.
Mm-hmm.
And their routine usually involves taking a bit of a break, being a little out of breath. And then one morning they were swimming and they just noticed they'd gotten into a rhythm. They didn't need to take any breaks. And it was a form of embodied meditation. They were swimming, but they weren't thinking about anything specific. And the meditative experience while they were performing physical activity was very satisfying for them.
Mm.
And so that state is a state that they can replicate in other activities other than swimming now that they got in touch with it.
Interesting, because you generally think, if I can't breathe, that's probably not something I'm going to consider a flow state. But they got to the point where they were in flow from something that they do every day that they hadn't thought about. Interesting. So do you suggest people do it for an extended period of time? Like you said, for a month, you're saying that people should write?
Well, my view is that you should do it for at least 3 weeks to have a base of data. Now, quite frankly, I've been collecting emotional highs. I started doing this in 2008, and I've been collecting ever since. But at the very least, have 3 weeks of data only if you've collected 4 or 5 a day.
Okay.
And then when you've kind of got those 30 or 40 emotional highs to look at, I'll be able to point out patterns that you yourself might not even notice.
Okay. What about the opposite? Let me be, the contrarian here for a second.
Sure.
What about sometimes the things that push us away from focusing on the emotional highs? Sometimes there may be an activity, like using that example of the swimmer that's probably thinking, I got to get these laps done. My God, it's the only, say, 40 minutes I have in my day to get it done. And something switched in him or her. Sometimes there's things that we actually do that deplete us, but we continue because of habituation. I always do this, and I do this after, and we get into that. I always say depletion versus replenishment is my concept that I talk about. Is there any in the flow work or the strength finders? Is that already kind of parsed out at the beginning when they're doing the assessment, or?
So StrengthsFinder basically parses out that in terms of it highlights talents that are intrinsically satisfying to you.
Okay.
However, when you look at depletion or negative states, or you look at flow blockers, many times, let's call the worst example of that bad flow. Let's just call it bad flow for sake of argument.
Yeah.
If you use the wrong talent for a particular task, your talent can actually put you into bad flow.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I get very stimulated by learning or reading a chapter of a book. A requirement of that is no interruptions, which is a major flow blocker.
Right.
If I'm trying to get stimulated from reading a chapter of a book and I'm continually being distracted or interrupted, my experience is going to be fundamentally different than the flow experience. So I do ask people to track their emotional lows as well, because more often than not, an emotional low is still involving your talents, but it's helping you get in touch with, okay, I'm using the wrong talent at this moment. I need to now switch talents.
Okay, that makes sense then. So it's like a fit, right? Because sometimes I'm a reader too. And what happens is sometimes I have to not read. And I'm just curious about this, is like, let's say we talk about reading, right? I love reading, but sometimes I've had such a long week that I think, oh, I'll listen to this Audible, and I'm like, oh boy, I'm not getting anything out of it. So I actually have to disconnect, and then I go back to it, and I'm loving it again.
That's a perfect example. The exact same activity, but you were in two completely different states from the first time to the second time.
Oh, okay.
And at the end of the day, and flow, your performance is strongly correlated to your state. If you look at the work that you do as well. And so medicine and psychology, 150 years of research in medicine of psychology have shown us that your performance is strongly correlated to your state. Now, we've focused on compromised performance due to illness and injury. And then sports psychologists started looking at peak performance, that idea being in the zone. But fundamentally, in both cases, your performance is correlated to your state. And at the end of the day, even flow, you can't be in flow forever. It is its own depleting experience over time. Right. And so it's important to understand, the other thing that I recommend for people is a talent-based power hour. Okay. And a power hour doesn't have to be done at the same time, can be done throughout different 5 or 10 minute windows during the day, but do something that puts you into flow, but only for 5 or 10 minutes. And that will kind of elevate your state and doesn't run the risk of depleting you because you're not overdoing it. And the nice thing about state is I can elevate my state by stimulating my thinking by reading. And now that I'm in that state, I'll actually run faster when I go for my run. The states translate.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. So again, it's going internal, which is what I talk a lot about, and really getting connected, understanding, and pivoting as you need to maximize on that time that you're going to focus on whatever the biggest boulder is that you need to achieve that day.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and from an authenticity perspective, I'm sure that you can tell when someone you're working with is in the state of flow. It's a very genuine state. You can tell they're loving what they're doing. You can tell they're genuinely interested in helping you love what you're doing. Flow is very contagious. We pay lots of money to go watch people in a state of flow, even if we don't do the activity that they do, right?
Absolutely. And, I've seen it with my son. So he was an athlete. He played hockey, but then he switched to golf a couple of years ago. And, I could see the development. He'd had some natural talent, but then when he made that shift and he started to go from, oh, I'm okay, to I'm getting better and then he finally ended up going up, to a higher level, going up to the Ontario League. And I could see him the one time, right, and he'd been working, and then he would go and he would get badly, plummeted by the other competitors. And I of course, I know I would see his body just kind of reacting. And then a couple of, say 6 months later, he went back to the same kind of events, and it didn't matter what happened. Nothing affected him. And I was like, same guy, same kid, same kind
Yeah.
of level of events, but it's
Yeah.
almost like it didn't matter. The last shot did not matter. And it was just about the next shot. Whereas the time
Yeah.
before, it was completely, he was absorbed by what wasn't going well and,
Yeah.
all those things. So I could kind of, it was actually kind of fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. And I think the three preconditions to flow is the goal. The goal is clear. You know exactly what you're trying to do. You can see success in your mind's eye. The challenge is slightly stretch. If it pushes you just a little bit, and you have immediate feedback, you know exactly how you're doing as you're doing it. So golf is a perfect example of clear goal, stretch, challenge, immediate feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And it always has to be, as you mentioned, it always has to be on the hole you're shooting for, not the one you just shot, not the one you're going to shoot
Right.
after. The hole you're shooting for is what puts you into flow. And that's the shift that you saw, is he was focusing on the hole he was shooting for.
Absolutely. And it's funny because his body language would I could be a hole away and I could tell when it was earlier what kind of hole he was having. And then after that, I couldn't tell. I was like, was that a bad hole or was that a good hole? Because his nonverbals and even his swing, I couldn't tell after a while, even if it was and his dad would say, oh, that was a horrible hole. And I go, oh, I couldn't tell.
Yeah.
So you have done some research on flow. So tell us a little bit about that, because I'm always, the original thinkers and people that are adding to things like this, I'm always fascinated about. So tell me a little bit about the research that you've done.
So it was fascinating research. Did it last year. It went over 5 weeks. If you were a participant, I would basically send you a set of questions on a Monday and then a set of questions on a Friday. So twice a week. And I did that for 5 weeks in a row. I had 81 pieces of data for each participant. So I had over 4,000 pieces of data in my study. And one of the things that I discovered, one of the questions that I asked people was, what's your hobby? In other words, what do you love to do, whether you're paid for it or not?
Okay.
And the participants had done StrengthsFinder, so I knew what their talents were. And then I asked them to rate the presence of their talent in their hobby. And 90% of the participants said there was a strong presence of at least 3 of their 5 talents.
Okay.
From a coaching perspective, this was fascinating, because if I know you like karaoke, Roxanne, if that's all I know about you, I probably can't really translate that knowledge into any kind of coaching for for you to become more effective at work. Mm-hmm. But if I know let's say you have the talent called woo, which is winning others over, creating instant rapport, meeting strangers, making people feel comfortable right away. If I know that, and you feel woo is strongly present when you're doing karaoke, now that we know what woo looks like in you, I can translate that to your work. And so it's this idea, if you know what your talents look like at play, that can be used as a metaphor for applying your talents at work.
What amazing information to take back to the workplace, right? Because oftentimes we think of play, we look at children and you look at them and they're so natural, and as we get older, what do? That's the first thing that goes is play. Yeah. But to look at it from the perspective of a hobby, and then to learn about the person, because I would think that's fascinating, bringing that back into organizations and into teams.
Well, from a coaching perspective, again, if we've had this conversation, I know your hobby, I know your 5 talents, I can just and we're struggling with a challenge at work, I can ask you to just start describing, okay, you have input, and you're a drummer. Mm-hmm. What does input look like when you're drumming? And they start describing it, and they get very animated as they describe it. And typically, if it's a drummer and he's describing input, he'll say, okay, he's paying attention to the percussion, he's paying attention to his own playing, he's paying attention to everyone else. Are they in sync? He's paying attention to, is the song being produced holistically? So he's paying attention to 5 different things in parallel. Right. And if any one of those things is slightly out of sync, it's usually the drummer that gets it back into sync. So just his description of input that way, did you hear all that information and how I could translate that to work? Right. Paying attention to 5 different channels at a time, detecting when one's slightly out of sync, finding a way to bring it back into sync almost nonchalantly. that's a very powerful strength to have at work.
Absolutely. And I would think that if you have a team that's in, let's say, or in flux or stuck, that you can equally use that as important based on the roles that they're playing in that team in reference to a project also.
For sure.
Right?
For sure. So
know.
here's a guy who happens to like drumming.
Mhm.
And through that information, we've now figured out how he might be a key component of getting this team that's in flux back into sync.
Yeah, because he's multifaceted. He's got 5 elements.
Yeah.
Versus kind of the microscopic person that could just see maybe 1 or 2.
Yeah.
He has like he's almost, he can get that aerial shot.
Yeah.
Because of his talents to be able to bring that to the team.
And you see what you just described is what a drummer does, and what you just described is someone at work who can get a team on track. It's the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so that research was fascinating to me, only from the perspective of, before that research, if I knew your hobby, I still didn't know how to coach you. Now I do. Right.
So is there a book that you put this into, or a research paper, a white paper somewhere out there?
There's a summary of capstone findings.
Okay.
And so, which I'm glad to send to anyone who's interested. My email is omer@peakperformance.engineering.
Okay.
And I also have a tool that'll help you collect your own emotional high data, totally free. And then I have a tool that's an icebreaker that'll help you just get in touch with what puts you into flow. So if you're interested in the research, if you want to start collecting emotional highs, please send me an email. I'm glad to send you any of this information.
Well, it's all fascinating. I've learned some stuff from a different perspective, and recognizing that I have to spend a bit more time in understanding my flow, because I know my points.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think I don't accentuate it as much as you're suggesting, which would be a really, really such a benefit to be able to do that. Now, tell everyone, I'm sure people are fascinated about learning a lot more about this, where they can reach you, and that they might want to reach out and potentially, use you in training or coaching.
Absolutely. So I think the easiest way to get a hold of me is omer@peakperformance.engineering. That's my email. And if you just want any of the tools, just mention that. I'll send them back to you. If you want to connect, have a quick conversation, omer@peakperformance.engineering.
Well, Omer, thanks so much. So what am I walking away with today? I think to recognize that we all have activities or things, or I'm going to think about my hobbies now, right? The things that I do that's fun, and what's happening to me. I think I've not ever done the Strengths Finders, but to really maybe potentially do that and look at how my hobbies help me understand what strengths I'm bringing, to all of the people, whether it's at work or at home, and how those strengths could be used. So for everyone, hope you got your sense of thinking about those emotional high points that Omer has talked about, and to focus some time and learn a bit more about yourself. If you're needing any more information on mental health and wellness, you can reach me at roxannederhodge.com.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.